Right, I've been asked to do just a 5-minute sort of taster of what we had last time, so hopefully this will refresh your memory. A nice thing is, if this works, oh, that's the wrong one. I get to be, for a couple of minutes, I get to be Professor Mark Maslin and do a couple of his slides. So, this is our problem. Temperatures are going up. We're already at 1 degree above 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. 2016 was the warmest year on record globally. So there's a clear trend in our temperatures, and they're going up. What that means is we're going to get more and more extreme seasons. Just like last year in the UK, we had an extreme heat wave in the summer, and these are different pathways that we could potentially take. So this is the one we want to take, the 1.5 degree C rise. If we could limit warming to that level, that's regarded as relatively safe, and that's the aim of the Paris Climate Accords. And that will give us, even if we go down that pathway, then the risk of an extreme season is 1 in 4. So every 4 summers we'll have 1 extreme summer. If we go as far as, which we could easily do, 4 degrees of warming up at the top, then we'll end up with 9 out of every 10 summers being an extreme season. That means the sea level rises, more extreme weather, which means most people around the world live close to waterways, and in London, obviously, we're protected by the Thames Barrier, and there would be a huge cost to upgrading the Thames Barrier, and that the higher the sea rise, the more adaptation, the more money we'll need to spend on adapting. So, how do we limit ourselves to 1.5 degrees Celsius? And this is a slide just showing these are our historic CO2 emissions up here, going up and up and up to the current day. And the idea is we've got to come all the way down on the carbon descent, back down to zero. And in fact, what we need to do, the longer we leave it to turn the corner and start going down, the more we'll have to do in terms of negative emissions. So there's a lot of things like planting trees, but also ideas such as burning biomass and then capturing the carbon and storing it in the ground, ways of taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So the more we leave it, the more we have to resort to potentially extreme measures to try and get down to the 1.5 degree safe limit. So that's the end of the climate science. So back to my slides. So just a few more slides. So just a reminder that using this territorial approach to carbon emissions, so drawing a ring around Camden and saying anything that happens within the boundary of Camden, we're going to count those emissions, then 1/4 of emissions come from homes, only 13 from road transport, and the majority, just over 60%, come from our non-domestic building stock. So 87% of emissions come from buildings, energy being used in buildings. So what have we got to do? Well, it's not one or the other. It's not just reducing demand, and it's not just increasing renewable energy supply. So some people will say, we don't like wind farms, why don't we just all insulate our lofts? That doesn't work. We've got to do both. We've got to reduce demand and increase renewable energy supply, because we've got to get to zero carbon. And renewable energy is indispensable in that sense. We'll never get to zero carbon without having our entire supply from renewable energy. It would be very difficult, or at least from zero carbon energy. So the focus, as you'll probably remember, hopefully, 2 minutes, yep. Last time I talked about a study that I'd done on Camden, looking at how Camden could get, what Camden could get to by 2030. And the focus was on shifting transport and heat to electricity. And by doing that, we can use much more efficient systems. So heat pumps are much more efficient than boilers, but they use electricity, and then we can supply electricity renewably and get to zero carbon. So you remember these pictures. It's a very large air source heat pump there in the top right-hand corner, and a smaller residential system at the bottom. So one of the questions you might have been thinking is, how do we actually generate our electricity? And does it mean that if we switch to electricity for transport and heating that we'll reach zero carbon? And you can see that if we go back to 2008, a very small proportion of our electricity was zero carbon. But if we look now, look how much that green bar, which is the renewables, has grown. A massive increase in renewable energy provision across the UK, particularly from solar and wind, and also nuclear. So nuclear is zero carbon in use, whatever you may think of it. And so by 2030 and by 2035, we're going to have the vast majority of our electricity will be generated from zero carbon sources, but not all of it. We've still got some of the blue, which is gas there, so we won't, if we're importing grid electricity, unless this turns out to be better than we're expecting, then we won't get to zero carbon by 2030. So the study results showed that with a relatively conservative mix of measures, we could get to 57% reduction for Camden's carbon emissions against the 2005 baseline. If the grid doesn't decarbonize at all from now, then we wouldn't get quite as far. We'd only get to a 45% reduction. If we could ban the retrofitting of gas boilers across all homes, existing and new build, from 2022, we'd do much better. We'd get to 68%. And this is just to remind you that other emission sources exist. So we didn't look at flying, agriculture, imports, but those are all important as well. Thank you very much.